On today's show, it is now August. The Hawks have a new assistant coach, as well as some over-under talk, bench stuff, and more. All of that is on the way.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1532 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Wednesday evening here in early August. And today's podcast, we'll be breaking down some mailbag questions. There was a little bit of news in recent days. I should say at the top of the podcast, though, that we encourage you to make us your first listen each and every day. Please subscribe to the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts, places like Apple and Spotify, as well as YouTube on the video side. I should also plug that I've been doing some crossover episodes with some of my good friends in recent days. I had Tyler Jones on the podcast for a 3-part episode last week. I had Glenn Willis on the show over the weekend, only a few days ago now, talking about kind of the summer and what's going on in Hawksland. Of course, we are sort of in the dead of the offseason at this point in time, but still there's plenty to discuss always. We are transitioning now into our sort of offseason schedule. 2 or 3 times a week, we'll be here talking about the latest with the team, but plenty to discuss on today's show and some mailbag questions. But first, some news that I actually neglected to hit on last week. I realized earlier this week, and I've not talked about this just yet on the podcast, but it made the rounds in early July, actually, and in Las Vegas, that the Hawks were adding Ronald Norred to their coaching staff in some fashion. That was confirmed at the end of last week, at the end of July, when his agency, which is Priority Sports, announced that it was official on Friday. I confirmed that shortly after and reported that definitively Norred is simply an addition to the staff. He's not taking anybody's place that is leaving the staff. This is already a pretty big coaching staff. You know, there's not really a mandate as to how many assistants teams have. There's only so many that you can have on the bench, but there are behind the bench assistants, and the Hawks have a pretty large staff now under Quinn Snyder. Norred is a guy, and is sort of a young guy, actually, for coaching circles. He's in his early 30s. He was probably first known as a player at Butler on those teams with Brad Stevens, and he was sort of a key piece of some of those really, Final Four level teams. He's been an NBA assistant the last couple of years, including the last 2 with the Pacers, where he left in, I guess, early July to come over to the Hawks. The timing is a little bit odd because the Hawks already announced their quote-unquote finalized coaching staff back in mid-June, so like 6 weeks ago at this point in time. But Norred is very well thought of in the industry. So if you can add a guy like that at any point, you probably want to do that, especially when you're not losing anybody else. So it's kind of a pure addition rather than a subtraction or a swap of any kind. The Hawks not announced that in any form. They confirmed it to me, so it is what it is. It is the dead zone at this point in time. They don't have to really talk about that with coaches. It's not like a formal announcement that has to happen. But add Ronald Norred to your score sheets at home with regard to the bench at this point around Quinn Snyder, another guy that is going to be around and certainly a good addition by all descriptions that I can glean at this point in time. Okay, after that, the rest of the podcast is going to be basically mailbag questions, and we have some great ones. I should say at the top of the podcast, I said this on Twitter /X the other day. I guess that's what we'll call it from now on in a lot of different ways. But there are 3 ways to get your mailbag question answered on this podcast. One of them is to send it to me on Twitter /X, either at BT Rowland, which is my personal account, or at Locked On Hawks, which is the show account. You can also email them to me at lockedonhawks@gmail.com. And a third way, which I guess I'm going to push a little bit harder in the coming days, is that if you want to leave a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts, there is space to ask a question or leave positive feedback. If you ask a question there, I will find it there as well. So there's 3 options. We definitely always encourage you to leave those 5-star ratings and reviews anytime as well on the podcast. But some specific questions today on the show, and then some over-unders actually in the middle, which I got a few different questions about that. Talking about this at this pretty early juncture. We'll talk about all kinds of things. But first question, kick things off on the first mailbag of the month of August, comes from Andy, who says, can you tell us who the players are that are not allowed to be traded? I can never keep that straight, and there's been a lot of talk about Kobe Buffkin. So good question here from Andy. There are, as of today, it's a little bit weird. The timing, as I'm recording this podcast on Wednesday, August 2nd in the evening, which is important for one reason. But there are 5 guys that I will talk about on the Hawks roster with some restrictions. Now, both Kobe Buffkin and Mohamed Gay, as rookie contract signees, they both signed those rookie deals and announced those on July the 3rd. The rule is 30 days for rookies. Once the deal is announced and signed, you cannot be traded for 30 days. So those deals were not announced till the evening of July 3rd. So if it kind of depends on your reading of 30 days, whether it's like 30 full days or whatever. So it's either that they're eligible to be traded right now on August 2nd, or if you want to have kind of the more straight up definition and like 30 full days in between, it would be tomorrow/August 3rd. So for a month now, basically, Bufkin and Gay have not been able to be traded. And there's been a lot of, in my mind, kind of irresponsible talk about Kobe Bufkin with regard to the Raptors. Some Hawks fans just like flat out thinking the Hawks are just waiting for Kobe Bufkin to be eligible to be traded to go out and trade for Pascal Siakam. I've never heard that. Obviously, Toronto has been interested in him on some level. But as I said before on the podcast, if those two teams wanted to make a trade and agree to it, they could have done so days and weeks ago and just said, hey, we'll announce this on August 2nd, or 3rd. So I think that's probably a little bit overblown. But those guys, as of right now, basically, as you're listening to this podcast, probably on Thursday, Kobe Bufkin and Mohamed Gay will be eligible to be traded at the very latest on Thursday, August the 3rd. There are 3 more guys who are currently ineligible to be traded for the Hawks. One is Bogdanovich, who cannot be traded until September the 16th. Bogey signed an extension back in March, and the rule for that one is that it had to be 6 months after he signed that deal before he could be traded. So September 16th, that is basically right about when training camp will start to get close to opening. So he could be traded. I've not heard anything about him really being available in trades, but he can't be legally traded for another 6 weeks or so. Wes Matthews is another one who cannot be traded until December 15th. So basically, there's a couple of different listings that I won't bore you with now in the CBA about free agents and when they could be traded after they sign with a new team. Wes Matthews arrived as a minimum contract, not with his bird rights, etc. And he could be traded as early as December 15th if the Hawks were going to try to do that. And the last guy who currently cannot be traded is, of course, DeJounte Murray. This is the same thing as Bogdanovich in a lot of ways. Murray signed the extension and now cannot be dealt for 6 months. He officially signed that deal on July the 9th. So it's January the 9th for DeJounte Murray. Other than Bogey and Murray this year, a big kind of recent-ish example of this is that the Hawks signed Capella to an extension late in the summer a couple of years ago. Because he signed it so late, he actually couldn't be traded for even longer than 6 months because 6 months fell after the in-season deadline for trade. So I talked about that a lot back in that cycle on the podcast. That was kind of a weird one. But with Bogey, they signed it early enough where that won't be a problem. Same with Murray. Again, I would still guess that Murray is not traded, but as far as the Siakam stuff, there's a reason why Murray was kind of immediately off the board because the Hawks, as soon as he signed that contract, he cannot be traded until at least January the 9th. So hopefully that answers the question. There are 5 guys as of maybe this moment, but as of tomorrow, basically, it only becomes 3 guys who can't be traded, and that is Bogdanovich, Wes Matthews, and DeJounte Murray. All right, some more questions to answer with regard to over-unders, especially, and then we'll get into some bench hierarchy questions. And at the end of the podcast, even some stuff about maybe Christian Wood and Kelly Oubre, PJ Washington, etc. But first, a word from our sponsors on today's show. Today's show is brought to you by Ibotta. You're probably taking that vacation that you've actually been planning and also dreading, perhaps, everything you actually have to buy and do before you actually leave for that vacation. It is long past time to stop spending your hard-earned money without getting anything in return, and that means using Ibotta. Ibotta gives you cash back on tons of different grocery items, from produce to personal care to pantry goods, and that way you can make sure that beating inflation, no matter what you're actually purchasing at this point in time. Either link your loyalty account right now, upload your receipt after you shop, and get your cash back. It's just that easy with Ibotta. The average user earns $120 per year. That covers the entire cost of a shopping trip, perhaps, or maybe cash back on the flight that you might be buying on that particular trip you might be taking, or the game you're trying to go to, dinner you might be craving, etc. There are definitely options with Ibotta. Other apps might give you points that don't actually amount to much. With Ibotta, you actually get real cash back and cash out to your bank account, to PayPal, or even to gift cards. You can earn cash back to hundreds of different retailers as well. That includes places like Lowe's or Macy's or Sephora, Best Buy, etc. And right now, Ibotta is offering our listeners $5 for just by trying the app today if you use the promo code LOCKED when you register. Go to App Store right now, or Google Play Store as well. Download the free Ibotta app and just use that promo code LOCKED when you get there. That is IBOTTA in the Google Play or App Store, and use the promo code LOCKED when you get there. Check out Ibotta today. All right, it is that time of year when I'm starting to get questions and tweets and concerns and intrigue about over-unders. So I figure it's time to check in a little bit on this. It is very early on this for sure. For some backdrop, I basically have done, I think, 4 or 5 years in a row on this podcast, a full-blown deep dive into over-unders with my friend Robbie Cowland of Diamond UPROXX, who I work with over there and I'm good friends with. He used to cover the Hawks, etc. And we'll probably do that later on in the summer. But if you're unfamiliar with this particular thing, it's become very popular in the last couple of years in NBA circles. But basically, every sportsbook releases these. Of course, FanDuel is our official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast. We'll be using FanDuel odds for today. But basically, it's a projection of an over-under on how many wins that the NBA team, in this case, the Hawks, will probably be getting in the upcoming season. You can bet on the over or the under on that. And we'll come back to the Hawks in a second. I'm going to kind of briefly talk about the entire Eastern Conference very, very briefly on this episode, and then do a little bit more on the Hawks at the end. So this is in order currently, as of, again, August 2nd, what FanDuel, our friends over there, have in terms of season win totals in order. So at the top of the East is the Celtics with 54.5 wins. Last year, they won 57 games. I'd probably lean over if I had to choose either way on that one, but I don't love it. They, of course, traded for Porzingis, traded Marcus Smart out, etc. The Bucks are at 53.5. They're number 2 on the list. I would kind of lean under there, actually, without Mike Budenholzer, and they're also a year older. Not a ton of depth, but they still have Giannis, which, of course, is very potent. They brought back Chris Middleton and Brook Lopez. You have the Cavs at number 3 at 50.5 wins. They won 51 games last year. All their guys that were pretty healthy throughout the season. The metrics were even better than that, but of course they had the ugly playoff loss. They got better on the margins with guys like Max Strus, etc. So I'd probably pass for now, but there you go. The Sixers and the Heat are back-to-back, and they have a lot of uncertainty. So Philadelphia is at 49.5 as of today. And without James Harden information, I would kind of just shrug my shoulders and move on. Last year, they won 54 games. I think, obviously, the number would be higher if Harden had not basically asked for a trade, because if Harden was engaged and available, the number would probably be much higher. We'll see. Miami is the other side of that coin in some respects, because I think everyone still assumes that they are the favorite to get Damian Lillard at some point. It's not a lock, but they obviously are the team that he wants to go to. They're currently at 48.5. If they don't get Damian Lillard, that is too high, in my opinion. Last year, the Heat were well below that. I was very right about the Heat in the regular season and very wrong about the Heat in the playoffs last season. I nailed that they were not going to be very good during the season, and I was very much too low on them in the playoffs. But regular season-wise, like I think with Jimmy and all that stuff, they don't try that hard in the regular season anymore, and they don't have a ton of depth, but they are certainly kind of, for the playoffs, obviously well-constructed, they're well-coached, etc. If they have Dame, I'd lean over on this number. I think it'll probably go up if they get Dame, so we'll see, and I wouldn't touch it for now. The Knicks are number 6. They are very healthy. At least they were last year. They won 47 games. That number is 44.5 for the Knicks, and they basically did not much this summer. They essentially lost Obi Toppin and added Dante DiVincenzo. That's kind of their only swap that they had. They bring Josh Hart back probably at some point with an extension, but that's kind of a shrug number. And then number 7 is the Hawks at 41.5. I will come back to them in a second with more. Number 8 in a tie, actually, is the Nets at 37.5 and the Pacers 37.5. The Nets, I have no idea yet, honestly. I will just tell you that now. I don't have my firm opinion formed on Brooklyn. Indiana, I'm a little bit lower on than everybody else seems to be. There's a lot of like buzz about Indiana. They have gotten better. I'll give them that. I'd probably lean under because I'm not sure I buy them at that level just yet, but nothing big there. The Bulls and Raptors have the same number at 36.5. That's at 10 and 11 in the Eastern Conference, respectively. The Bulls are trying to win. They're not very good, but they're trying to win. Still no Lonzo, unfortunately. They bring back Vooch, and DeRozan's still there, and Levine's still there. And it's kind of the same boring, uninspiring, but like not terrible team. The Raptors, I would probably lean under. Obviously, they were pretty healthy last year and still only won 41 games. And then they went from Fred VanVleet to Dennis Schroeder at the point guard spot. They could trade Siakam at any point. They could trade Anunoby at any point. Some bad vibes in Toronto right now. I'd probably lean under there. The Magic had the same number as well, 36.5. I kind of like them. They won 34 games last year. They're making out a lot of internal improvement from like Banchero and Franz Wagner and et cetera. Probably better guard play overall, but not a huge like overhaul either. So we'll kind of see on that one. I kind of like the Charlotte Hornets over, which is a weird sentence to say if you don't believe in the Hornets, like I usually don't, but it's 30.5. And last year they won 27 games, which is obviously really bad. But 2 years ago, they were in the play-in mix. And last year, LaMelo Ball played 36 games. And that was obviously a big part of why they were so bad. Also, ignoring for a second the off-court stuff, which is obviously troubling, Miles Bridges did not play last year. Miles Bridges was very good 2 years ago and is playing for the Hornets this year. So for better or worse, he's there. And with LaMelo Ball healthy right now, I would lean over there. Probably my best bet, other than the Hawks maybe, it would be the Hornets over. I like the Hornets over at this point in time. Obviously, it is still very early. Big caveats there. Detroit is 26.5. Last year, they were horrible, 17 wins. but basically play without Cade Cunningham all season long. I think Cade is going to be back and healthy, which is good. Still kind of a messy, weird roster in a lot of respects. I would kind of shrug right now. That's a very low number to go under on. So, and then lastly, before we get to the Hawks, the Wizards are at 24.5. It's really low. I would say I kind of lean over right now. They could kind of outwardly tank more than maybe they have in the past. I think they're starting to finally see the light with regard to not being just in the middle every single season. They blew it up smartly, I think. But if you look at their roster, if they actually try a little bit, they're not awful. Like Tyus Jones, my friend DeLon Wright, of course, Jordan Poole, who had a bad season last year, but is still pretty decent at basketball, Landry Shamet, Corey Kispert, Denny Avdia, Kyle Kuzma, of course, Daniel Gafford, Mike Muscala. Like, that's not terrible. They're not like the process Sixers bad. I wouldn't bet this either way because I think they probably do understand that they probably need to lose a bunch of games this year. And Jordan Poole and Kyle Kuzma are going to just be firing every night. But that's kind of the right number in some respects, at 24.5. And then back to the Hawks before we move on to something else. I will obviously do a lot more on this. So that I will just stress this is not my final opinion on the Hawks by any means. We have 2+ months to go. But the number is 41.5. And I believe that is too low. Now, if you don't know my work very well, you might assume that I am a homer. I cover a team specifically on this podcast. And most people that do that usually lean to the more positive side. And look, I've been positive on the team at times. I've been lower on the team at times. I will tell you what I think. And I am pretty much the opposite of your traditional homer in some respects. But I'll say this. They won 41 games last year. And I will be the first to acknowledge that it was a maddening season. They were pretty healthy. Again, probably top 3 in the league in terms of health. But I firmly believe that team last year should have won in the mid to high 40s with some sort of performance that was more in line with their talent level and coaching, execution, etc. I think Quinn Snyder is worth, I wouldn't say 10 wins, but I think he is worth multiple wins over the regime from last year without being, too shady at Nate. I think that Quinn is really good. I think he's, in that top, 5 to 8 level of regular season coaches for sure. So that's very healthy in the regular season. I think that definitely helps you. I also think that guys like DeJounte Murray will be better than they were last year, especially defensively. I think you can probably reasonably project better performances from guys like AJ Griffin and Jalen Johnson, maybe even DeAndre Hunter, Okongwu, etc. They have a full season now of Sadiq Bey, who helped them a lot last year offensively. And I think the depth for the full season now from like player 10 to player 13 is a lot better than it was for most of last season. So I get why the number is low. If you look at last year's numbers and what they did this offseason, as I talked about a lot with Glenn on the most recent episode of the podcast, they won 41 last year. And on paper, if you ignore like growth internally, they traded John Collins for nothing. And that doesn't make you better. But again, they brought in Snyder for a full offseason. This is still a very young team compared to most teams. And I think that 41.5, I would go over. Like I was expecting the number to be like 43.5 or 44.5. That's a little bit more interesting in some respects. I think 41.5 is so low that I really do like the over, like outwardly like the over. I'm not like giving you betting advice because that's not what we do on the podcast. But I think that that number is lower than I thought it was going to be. And as a result, I think that's a pretty good look at this early stage. And obviously, maybe it will change. These numbers often move. I remember a couple of years ago, the Hawks number went down during the offseason. A couple of years ago, at one point, the Hawks number went up like 2 spots. You can obviously shop around, but I think FanDuel is the best place to find all of your odds on this stuff. And FanDuel 41.5 is where the Hawks are. And I like the over here in early August. All right, some more mailbag questions to come. But first, a word from our sponsors on today's podcast. Okay, question coming from Jacob, who says, rank these players by how many minutes they're actually going to play this season. Buffkin, Gay, Lundy, Norris, Mills, Garrison Matthews, Wes Matthews, Vít Krejci, and Bruno Fernando. So in case this wasn't clear, Jacob basically listed every player that is not in the top 9 that I talked about a lot. There's a very obvious top 9 players that the Hawks have, and this is literally everyone else on the roster. I am going to answer the question with a ranking, but I at least have to lead with the fact that this would be very different based on injury. So like this is variable in a lot of ways. Like for instance, if there was a long-term, even like a month-long injury to one of the centers, I think Bruno would be number 1 on the list because he has to play every night basically if that happens. If there was an injury to Trey or DeJounte, I think Patty Mills, Kobe Buffkin would go higher on the list because they would need to play guard minutes, and so on and so on. So it is really hard to answer this question, but I'm trying to take into account like sort of normal injury luck and normal rotation stuff. But I will say this is not going to be accurate. I'm going to get something wrong on this list because of injuries or trades or whatever. I'm going to do reverse order. I'm also going to remove Vít Krejci. Not personal. I do kind of like Vít Krejci, but I think if the Hawks do nothing else, which is not a given, but if the Hawks just roll with this team, I think what they're probably going to do in September, if they do that, is cut Vít, because he's non-guaranteed and they have too many guys right now. So if that were to happen, he comes off the list. Sorry, Vít. Not a guarantee by any means, but there you go. I think very obviously Miles Norris is going to be last on the list. Number one, he's on a two-way contract. There's also a lot of guys ahead of him at the position, and the Hawks didn't really draft him, so he just has to be at the bottom of this list. Doesn't mean he's going to definitely finish there, but I think just projection-wise, I would go there. After that, it becomes harder every step of the way. I'm going to say that Mohamed Gay is less likely to play more minutes than Seth Lundy. I think Mohamed Gay, being a guy who is going to need some more seasoning, he is younger, more of a future-facing upside bet, and there's a lot of guys ahead of him at the power forward spot. I would go with him as a second guy to play the least, basically. Then Lundy, who I think, it's a little bit strange. I understand that Lundy was drafted behind Gay, but as I talked about with Glenn earlier this week, Lundy's a lot easier to project than Gay. He's definitely a lower ceiling player than Gay. No one's saying otherwise. Less talented player in a lot of ways, like physically, but he is older, Lundy is, and has that one skill of his shooting that get him on the court. Like if you get an injury to Bogey or Griffin, Lundy could get a real look in a way that probably Gay needs multiple stuff to actually get him on the court. Now, it gets very hard after this because I have no idea. Again, I'm just going to be candid. I have no idea how the Hawks feel about Patty Mills right now. If he's on the team when camp opens, I'm going to assume he's the third point guard on opening night behind Trey and DeJounte. Kind of in the Aaron Holiday role from last year. Very different player, but Aaron Holiday played some, didn't play some, and was kind of that 10th, 11th, 12th man for all of last season as that veteran guard. And whenever Trey or DeJounte were out, you knew Aaron was going to play. And that's kind of how I think it would be with Patty Mills if he's on the team. Of course, by the end of the season, you could have Kobe Buffkin in that role, especially as he sort of grows and grows and grows, as rookies often do. But in October, I think Patty Mills is going to be a more likely guy to help them win a game than Buffkin, because Patty Mills is 15 years older and much more seasoned, etc. Then you have the two Matthews who are interesting. So anyway, my guess is that with normal injury luck, I'll say Garrison Matthews plays less than Buffkin and less than Mills. Buffkin has the incentive that a lot of teams do, like first round picks most of the time, not with Jalen Johnson 2 years ago with Nate, but usually a team wants to at least see their first round pick play a little bit during the course of the season. Then Mills, then Bruner, and then Wes Matthews. So here's my order from least minutes from most to least right now. Top to bottom, most minutes, least minutes of the non-top 9 guys in this order. Again, this is a very wild early projection. My apologies. But number 1, Wes Matthews. They just signed him. He's a proven veteran. May not play every night, but I think he's going to be number 1 on the list. I'll go with Bruno Fernando next because, again, of what I said before, like any injury, I think it's very obvious that both Clint and Onyeka are not going to play 82 games each. So anytime either one of those guys is out, if Bruno is healthy, he's going to play at least 10 minutes tonight probably, and that matters. Then I'll go with Mills, then Buffkin, then Garrison Matthews, then Lundy, then Gay, and then Norris. Again, one more time, camp doesn't start for 2 months almost. Long way to go here. This is going to change multiple times, but that's where I would be right now on August 2nd. And finally, last question on the podcast today comes from Nathan, who says, can you explain to me why the Hawks or other teams even have not signed Christian Wood or Kelly Oubre? I read something about PJ Washington being restricted, so I'm guessing that's why he is available, but I don't understand the other two. First, I'll use this as an opportunity to point out just how barren the free agent market is right now on August 2nd. I noted that a little bit when the Hawks signed Wes Matthews, but it is even uglier now than it was then. We'll come back to Wood and Oubre and Washington in a second to answer the question, but just as a reminder, like it's names like Ish Smith and Hamidou Diallo and Jalen Noel and Bismack Biyombo and Derek Jones Jr. Like it's not impressive. There's some guys there that could be useful for sure. Like for instance, I like Ish Smith as like a third point guard in a lot of teams. Jalen Noel is pretty interesting. Derek Jones Jr. is kind of interesting in a certain way. Biyombo, rock solid third center. Like if the Hawks didn't have Bruno, I would be advocating for them to sign Biyombo. It's not sexy at all, but he can play for you if you had to. But obviously Wood and Oubre, to answer the question, are much more talented than those guys. I put up big numbers. It looks odd that they're still available. I do understand that. Like for instance, Oubre averaged 20 points a game last year. That happened. Like he wasn't particularly good, but he averaged 20 points a game last year in the NBA, and he's unsigned and might sign for the minimum somewhere. Part of that is that it was below average in efficiency. He's been always like kind of a maddening, inconsistent player by all accounts on offense and defense. Like Christian Wood, kind of similar, like obviously has always been efficient and good on offense. Like I think everyone kind of agrees he's a very good offensive player when he's engaged, but he doesn't usually like stay in good graces with teams. Like he's been kind of around the league at this point, and no one seems to want to keep him when they have him. That's usually a pretty good indication of like it's not the easiest guy to fit in. Plus defensively he's pretty bad. So I'm not saying they're not talented. They are. Both Oubre and Wood are kind of lumped together here because of obvious reasons, but if you take a sort of a step or two back beyond the stats and consider the market and what they do, what they don't do, it's not that surprising that they're not signed. I think Oubre is an easier fit than Wood because Oubre is a wing, and guys who are athletic on the wing like can fit different places. Like I don't think he's great, but I think he would probably help some teams as a third or fourth wing on those rosters. But also, from what I hear, like I think they're both asking for real money, and like it's not really out there for them. So it would not surprise me if they were on minimum contracts, which is crazy given their stats, but it's kind of where we are at this point. And to wrap it up, also, PJ Washington is much different, and I think that he would definitely have a job right now if he was unrestricted. And I think the Hornets are going to bring him back at some point because the Hornets are just doing this like it's a cold calculation, but it happens sometimes. There's usually one guy or two per cycle that are restricted. They just get squeezed. And unfortunately, this year it's PJ Washington. But basically, like they can hold on for a while if they want to, and the market's just not there for them. There's nowhere for him to go out and get an offer sheet. So the Hornets could just kind of squeeze and squeeze. To bring things locally, like Capella back in Houston, actually, before he came to Atlanta, signed his deal in Houston like in very, very, very late July because the market was not there for him. The Hawks could have done this with John Collins. That's one of those like kind of, door number one, door number two things. Like I've talked about this in the past, but there was kind of not a huge market to give Collins an offer sheet. And the Hawks, rather than taking this route, like Charlotte is taking, or like Houston took with Capella, elected to just kind of pay John his market value instead of squeezing him, which I think burned them in the end. It's good for like player relations, but as far as like the cold calculation of like just finances, that they probably could have squeezed him a lot more. Anyway, I think Washington would help a lot of teams. I think he might be a little bit overrated in some circles, but like he's a good player. He's definitely a rotation guy. I think at the mid-level, he'd be interesting. Like for instance, the Hawks have most of the mid-level right now. They could offer that to PJ Washington. They're not going to, I don't think. And part of that is that the Hawks don't want to go on the tax. That's one thing. But the consensus happens basically around the league, and just asking a little bit around the league, is that I think Charlotte would just match that deal. Like with Grant Williams, for instance, a very kind of a similar player, maybe similar value to PJ Washington at the same position a lot of ways. What happened there was that Boston didn't really want to keep Grant Williams, so they did they let him go in a sign and trade for about the mid-level. But Washington hasn't had that suitor just yet. And I think Charlotte would just kind of match a reasonable offer, which I think was at this point, it kind of has to be the mid-level. So ultimately, I think he'll go back to Charlotte on something, whether it's a 1-year deal, qualifying offer, or maybe some, modest 4-year deal or whatever. But it's unfortunate. RFA is a tough situation for the player unless they're at the top of the market, and he's not quite there. So it's kind of he's kind of in that weird zone where he's a good player. He's not that good to like entice crazy offers, and unfortunately, he's kind of been squeezed. But hopefully, this is the question. And I probably get once every couple of days someone like kind of begging for the Hawks to sign Kelly Oubre or the Hawks to sign Christian Wood. Christian Wood doesn't make any sense with the Hawks, I don't think. I mean, I guess for the minimum, you might just do it because you can do it. But I don't know what his role would even be in Atlanta. Oubre, I can see it a little bit easier. He's just a wing, and that's what happens. But I have not heard that the Hawks are interested in either guy. The Hawks have too many players right now, and they have they do have some money to spend if they want to spend it. But anyway, I wouldn't hold your breath on that too much, but I might be wrong, and we'll see. But they are definitely, those three guys, Kelly Oubre, PJ Washington, and Christian Wood, are definitely the most famous free agents available, unless you want to count Blake Griffin, because he's at the end of his career as well. But we'll see where they all land. I think they probably all have jobs, but we'll see where they actually are. Okay, I have done enough rambling on today's podcast. I will have pretty much like a mailbag a week probably going forward in the offseason. As I said at the top of the podcast, I'm probably going to be in this like 2 to 3 episode per week zone right now, barring news. If there's big news, I'll definitely talk about it. But this is the official dead zone. So basically from the beginning of August to like the middle of September is the real dead part of the NBA season. But and most podcasts kind of just go dark during this time. I'm not going to do that. I promise you. I'll have some guests. I'll have some mailbags, I'll have some topics, etc. We'll be here covering the latest on the Hawks, but not 5 times a week like we often do during the season, etc. So hopefully that is understood at this point in time. And I definitely encourage you to subscribe to the podcast. I really appreciate everyone that's already done that. We've had a really good year so far, and I appreciate everyone for go ahead and check out the podcast either on YouTube or on all the audio platforms like Apple and Spotify. It does wonders if you are trying to support the podcast to subscribe and download across multiple channels, whether it be video and audio, etc. Auto download the podcast, tell a friend about the show, spread the word here in the offseason to kind of help us build things up for the upcoming season, as it is always rapidly approaching. Also, you can find my written work sort of intermittent in the offseason, but still at patreon.com/BT Rowland. If you want to follow the show on Twitter/X at Locked On Hawks, you can follow me there as well at BT Rowland. And yeah, thank you for listening to the show, everybody. I really do appreciate it. I don't know when the next show will be, but it'll be in the next few days probably. So stay tuned, subscribe to the podcast, and we'll see you all next time.